Welcome back, everybody. Now, as South Africa's political landscape remains tense with the Democratic Alliance and the ANC still locked in complex negotiations, we still do not have a cabinet yet. Negotiations hit a snag on Wednesday when the ANC proposed a new arrangement involving fewer portfolios for the DA, reneging from earlier discussions. It needs to be noted, though, that a government of national unity is not in place just as yet. We only have a statement of intent. And as the parties are locked in negotiations towards establishing this GNU, we take a critical look at how the South African GNU can draw parallels from the GNUs of advanced economies, which are deemed a success, juxtapose that with the GNUs of those which flopped. And joining us virtually for these discussions is Dr Kagiso TK Pooe, Senior Lecturer at the Wits School of Governance. Dr. Pooe, very good morning. Thanks for joining us. Welcome.
Morning, and thanks for having me.
First of all, let's start with the negotiation deadlock between the ANC and the DA, of course, delaying the formation of the GNU. It could be viewed from two different standpoints, the pros and the cons. So an argument can be made that longer negotiation periods can actually mitigate problems of policy conflict within cabinets, thereby resulting in higher reform productivity. And on the other hand, it delays parliament business and compromises the timelines of legislative activity, with MPs being in limbo, not knowing whether they will proceed as MPs or they might be appointed to cabinet. So where do you stand with that school of thought?
No, thank you. Thanks for that overview. Look, I stand on 2 points. One, I think you're right in saying if it's purely based on policy discussions and working out how government is going to work, it is true that it does take longer and it's actually better. But unfortunately, this is not the case. If you read the agreement, and I'm one of those who's hesitant to call this a government of national unity owing to the fact that it's really not that, is they're only at the first stage. And the first stage in that agreement that was published is that they're just speaking about ministries. I believe where it's probably going to get a bit more complicated, as you correctly raised, is when they get to the second stage, which is actually saying, which they've said in the document, there's going to be policy discussions. So this point is really... And the problem at the moment is that it's purely based on positions. And the problem stems from the fact that I don't think both of them went into these negotiations with an actual clear plan of what are we negotiating for with regards to positions. And by that, I mean, problems dictate who should get what. And I think that the fact that both these parties and others have not really outlined what are the key problems facing South Africa means that this is why the deadlock has been happening. Because if it was just simply an issue of who does best what, it would have been an easier discussion to have and say, listen, party X, you do this well, so it's better if you were to get this position. But unfortunately, it just seems that that was not the case.
And I'm actually glad that you touch on the issue of obsession with positions. I mean, if you follow the political discourse, it's often more about who gets what, who gets which job, rather than about what needs to be done. In German coalition negotiations, for instance, parties by tradition try to do it the other way around. Agree first on all relevant political issues and projects in a coalition and then talk about appointments. But here in South Africa it's the other way around. Hence, we find ourselves in a vicious battle for cabinet positions, hence an intense political deadlock. So you reckon our obsession with positions is what defines our political fabric?
Yes, and look, this is not just unique to the ANC. I mean, if you look at the history of how the DA has negotiated, stepping back all the way to when former mayor and then premier Helen Zille took over the city of Cape Town, this is a very DA modus operandi. They speak about, listen, let's talk about policies, let's talk about what we do. But if you look at the history of, even when you go back to when they were negotiating with the IFP during the 90s and 2000s, that is a standard modus operandi in South African politics. So it shouldn't be viewed as something unique only to the ANC. It's just the way in South African politics that I think positions, or what I term shiny things, seem more important than defining and actually addressing the key problems, which is, look, we've got a horrible economy, social inequality and regional inequality. And that's what should be defining it. In fact, I'd take a step further, Simpiwe, and say we should actually be discussing less cabinet positions, not more cabinet positions. We should actually be shrinking ministries and saying, listen, how do we get a war cabinet which is going to tackle the key problems I've raised about unemployment, regional inequality, and the fact that there are people who are living in dire poverty.
Gosh, that's a standalone discussion on its own. Let's now zoom in on some of the mechanisms to underpin the durability of stable coalitions, drawing from successful GNUs of European economies as a case in point. In Germany, for instance, for coalitions to take place, and they are governed by political conventions and not necessarily by legislation, which means compliance with a coalition or a coalition agreement is not controlled by law. Can South Africa look into that?
It can, but I think the key point, and we raised this at the start, is terminology. Because look, I think a lot of people have gone with this idea of a government of national unity owing to the fact of South Africa's history. But what we really have in South Africa is a grand coalition, and that's what tends to happen in countries like Germany. And there's a huge difference between the two. A grand coalition, you can kind of expect that there are going to be long delays and things like this. A government of national unity is very specific. It's either a country has gone into deep, deep turmoil in terms of, here we're speaking about apartheid, or we talk about war. That's not the situation in South Africa. If anything, the only crisis that does exist is the fact that the ANC has crashed to the levels that it has. So because if you took it from that point, then I think the delays we are seeing kind of make it a bit easier, because if you're negotiating a grand coalition, you can then expect that there's complexities such as the one that we're experiencing.
Yes.
And I think it makes it easier for us to interpret it.
And there are some failures of some of the GNUs. I mean, the Zimbabwean GNU did not enable lasting solutions to Zimbabwe's socio-political and economic crisis. In Lesotho, on the other hand, the first two GNUs barely lasted 2 years beyond their dates of constitution, while the third is already presenting signs of possible disintegration. So should we allow, I would say, a situation where GNUs are dominated by the interests of the leading political stalwarts, often ignoring the voices of local actors such as civil society organizations, including women's groups, churches, and traditional authorities?
Well, I think that's probably the complexity, in that you're already bringing a lot of people into the kitchen. If you bring in more actors such as civil societies, and we should be very honest, civil society and especially NGOs also have their own interests, which don't necessarily always line up with the national interest. So look, I think the best way to really put it is to say, look, give us something simple, which is standard, which we can measure what your agreement is really about. And my understanding, and when you look at all the manifestos from the ANC, the DA, the IFP, and the like, they all do highlight the key problem, which is the economy. So what we should be measuring them to say, listen, okay, what do you expect to do in the first year? We understand that you're not, the period of negotiations is going to be dragged out. That's not really what we should be concerned about, because government can and will run by itself for probably 2 or 3 months, owing to the fact that there's already budgets which have already been agreed upon. So that's not really the problem. What we should be holding them to account is to say, give us a plan for the things you guys highlighted in your manifesto. Not all of them, but it could be 5 key things. Number one being the economy. Give us that. What do you intend to do in the first year? And then I think this is when institutions like the SABC and other media houses can then just come in, publicize that, and so that the whole of the country knows that this is what we're holding you to account. We don't have to make it so complicated, because remember, we don't want to add more fuel to what is, I know, already confusion. So the key thing we should be asking them is, beyond what's happening now, is what is your plan for the first, the second, and the third year? Make that public, so that we can then be able to know what we're going to hold you to account to. Because I think we're not even there at that stage yet. And that's what, for me, gives me, a bit of a concern that we're not asking those pertinent questions.
And it becomes tricky, especially when two political parties have opposing ideologies when it comes to an approach to the economy, especially those who are battling for the economic cluster, for instance. And of course, national experiences, TK, cannot easily be transferred from one country to another. Constitutional frameworks, political traditions, established methods, and political circumstances vary a lot. And I suppose sharing our experiences may enrich our thinking on how to sort of approach the political process and on building coalitions. So from your vantage point, what would it take for South Africa to incorporate the facets of GNU models that have worked all these years into our own GNU model?
Well, three key things. One is, look, I think a bit of, we shouldn't be overly legal about this. South Africans have a habit of making everything very legal, and then we go to the courts. I think that probably makes things worse. So the first thing we should be avoiding in this, what I term a grand coalition, is don't take everything to courts. Don't put this into law, therefore it becomes problematic. So that's the first thing. Secondly, look, there does need to be a question of changing times, and that's the only thing probably I'll change legally is time frameworks. And I say frameworks of time because it would seem as though this newness sort of makes a lot of people, and also, even the business community, a bit uneasy. So if we probably had longer, not by longer, we don't mean more than a year, I think we should have those timeframes which are a bit locked in. And I would maybe make it a bit different to other countries and say, listen, it should be pre-election. And I was preaching this beforehand, that in Kenya, what they do beforehand is you kind of declare which coalition you're going to go into before the elections, right?
Yes, yes,
Meaning
yes.
you literally have 4 years to have this discussion, such that whatever the outcome is, at least there's a plan B and a C. And then the third thing would be, I think it's important that plans need to be put into the public, especially plans about the economy and how you intend to govern. I think that's probably the missing thing that will make most South Africans start to believe that, listen, there's political maturity in all the institutions involved. So I think these are the three things I would basically highlight.
All right, fair point. Thank you so much for chatting to us, TK. It's an absolute pleasure having you join us this morning.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. That was political analyst and senior lecturer at the Wits School of Governance, Dr. TK Pooe.